So hi guys, basically we are just starting one of that CKAD program here, right? And for the CKAD certification program, basically it is a start from Kubernetes basics. So we will start and we will discuss the Kubernetes here. What is the requirement and why we are using the Kubernetes? So it is little advanced level. People who are basically familiar with the containerization concept, Docker, and the basics of Kubernetes, right? So then they can move into a CKAD program, right? Kubernetes, certified Kubernetes applications developer, basically. Correct. So I request everybody just be on mute and whenever you have any questions, so I will take your questions as well at the end. So here we are discussing the basics of a Kubernetes. What is the basic requirement of a Kubernetes, right? So understanding the core concept and where this Kubernetes is going to help us, right? So you already know that the concept of a Docker and the containerizations, right? I believe you already know that Docker containerization, we basically package that entire application, right? And then we can create a container from the images, correct? So either it can be any type of applications, either it is a React.js or Angular or PHP or any kind of an applications. So image is nothing but your configuration file. From that, we can create that container. So container is nothing but is isolated sandbox, right? And it has own networking interfaces. Definitely these containers are using the shared CPU and the memory, right? But they have their own boundaries. So you can create a multiple containers. Okay. So once you define and you will have a multiple containers, so how you will manage these containers? So how these containers are connecting and interacting with multiple other containers, then how you will scale horizontally these containers, right? So whenever based on some requirement and is there any spikes or something like that, or how you will manage some kind of a security stuff, right? Or if you wanted to pass some data or extract some data, something we called as a volumes. So there are two options. One is that Docker is also provide it's some certain level facility for that. So that is called as a Docker Storm, right? But and also we have another option is a Kubernetes. So Docker is also provide the facility for, you can say, networking, also for managing the volume also, and also provide with the help of Docker Storm for connecting and interacting with the multiple containers like that. Or maybe when you are setting up your containers into a particularly nodes, right? When you have a multi-node setup, or you can say in the cluster setup like that. So, but still Docker Storm doesn't provide that much facility which is provided by the Kubernetes. So why we node a multiple nodes? So multiple nodes, basically, let's say if you wanted to deploy Jenkins or any other heavy applications, which is on AWS on T2 Micro. So T2 Micro doesn't have any CPU and or maybe this memory. So you need a much bigger machine. One thing. Another thing is that let's say you have some other applications also you wanted to deploy. So in that scenario, you need to deploy either these containers onto a separate nodes, or you can say some of that services you can deploy or put it into a one node, another applications onto a different node. So this you need to put some of that containers onto some particular node. So how you will define and how you will decide it, correct? So you need to have a proper, you can say, topology, or maybe that what we can say the solution for particularly on which node and which particular application is basically getting deployed here, correct? So these are the things you need to consider. Another thing is that you wanted to scale this particularly applications automatically, or another thing is that how you can self-healing concept. If there is a something goes wrong, you will automatically heal up. So you need to have that kind of a setup is very much required, correct? Then you also need to have a particularly what we can say, there is a networking concept, right? There is a and some much more advanced concept like that. Ingress is another facility which is supporting for a little higher level. Means if you want to restrict, right? So, and at Kubernetes level also, if you wanted to, one container will accept that request from only some of the containers. So let's say if you have a database, this database will not take a request from all these microservices or all other applications. It will take the request only for some certain applications only, correct? So either, so in some certain applications means some certain containers, what we can say. So this is another requirement, correct? Another thing is that if you wanted to have what we can say, there are network policies. So if you wanted to restrict, right, some of that, what we can say, the requirement or that inflows from particularly, you can say, not from all other applications will send that request to particularly your applications, right? So application to application access, how you can restrict it. So like this, there are many more facilities this Kubernetes provided. Correct. And it is a core heart of the deployment as of now for any applications. What we can say, either if you are managing the databases, you are managing the any microservices. So nowadays, there is a deployment. If you will go over the CI/CD or containerization concept, people use the Kubernetes, right? Or only that legacy applications, which is not completely moved into a Docker and the containerization, or maybe they are still not moved onto a containerization concept. They are not using, but except that all the latest deployment or development or this DevOps concept is built on top of the Kubernetes. Correct. So Kubernetes is an open source system for automatic deployment, scaling, management of a containerization application. So containerized applications, that is we already discussed and I already told you, right? So containers are nothing but how you are packaging your, you can say, the applications into, where you will get that without any runtime, without any installation, anything, you can run your applications, right? So there is a no installation basic setup required. That is the main core support, we can say, or that feature of the containerization, correct? So they make that shipping and deploying the application is a lot easier. So any application can work on your machine, can run on my machine or any other machines. So you don't need to be master into application for that, for deployment and running the applications, right? So they bundle all the dependencies into a single images basically, correct? Good part is nowadays, either let's say if you wanted to set up a RabbitMQ or maybe any other MySQL database or any other thing like that. So you don't need to do an installation, follow installation steps and check that your Windows softwares and all this stuff, right? You can directly pull the image and then run the image and then your application will be ready. That is simple. It is basically nowadays, correct? So that is all about, right? So Docker deployment, correct? So in any particularly, you will run that image and you can, nothing but you are basically creating a container, you access the container and process it, correct? So that is a very simple manner for your local testing purpose. But in the enterprise applications or the production setup, this particular setup is not going to work it out, first thing. Another thing is that when you are working with the Docker setup or the containerization concept on any other cloud environment, then how you will manage and you will do it, correct? So this is also very important, because if you wanted to what we can say, check that or create a multiple containers or scale it or all other stuff like this, so simple Docker will not going to help. Definitely at some certain level, let's say if you wanted to use it on AWS, so AWS Elastic Container Service, you have it, right? Where you can use it and you can create a different containers on different port or nodes, and then you can specify all other facilities round and around for security, node balancers and all other stuff like that. But still it is not very much providing a facilities or maybe giving a much more you can say really very strong, what we can say, the infrastructure and the application, right? The base architecture, what we can say, to handling the load or maybe for performance or for all of this stuff, correct? So for that, definitely we need to go for a Kubernetes, correct? So application configurations, service discovery, managing the updates, monitoring and the deployment, correct? So if you wanted to monitor, also you can check that all the steps based on your node, or maybe the memory consumption or CPU utilizations deployment. So just preparing some simple configuration files where you can provide all the details, or maybe you can run some simple commands, and then you can create the applications, right? You can check the connectivity, you can download the logs, you can do everything like that, correct? So all the application configuration, if you wanted to provide any other, what we can say, the environment variables, right? If you wanted to provide some kind of a access token, secret, and all other stuff. Let's say if you wanted to have any database details configuration, that is also, it is, you can provide it. Apart from that, many more things you can provide it. Any other data, let's say if you are putting your data from any other you can say local repository or local place to a container, or let's say if you are using elastic block store on AWS, so you are putting some data over there and you can use that data into your containers. So in that scenario, you can use as a volume, and then you can use this Kubernetes volume and provide that classes, storage classes. So you can like this. So there is also storage services you can use into GCP or Azure or AWS. So that either you can take also this data and keep it on your any other storage places. Either you can also use that network file systems. You can use that this block store like that service like that. So this is, you can get pass the data and take the data like that. So volume management you can just do very easily and properly, right? If you wanted to do some scaling, you can just do it. If you wanted to do memory or maybe CPU utilization, so through that configuration you can specify multiple containers you can deploy, right? So multiple containers you can specify and you can deploy here, right? And you can also manage that on these containers will be set up on which particular node, right? So that is something you can say, either use the node affinity, what we can say, node balancers, tolerations, many such facilities we have into a Kubernetes site, that is we can do it, correct? So that is much more details inside in it, right? So features are horizontal scaling, right? You can use that scaling feature, right? Automated rollout and rollback. So if you wanted to just patch the image which is newly you have created, so you can just patch the image into in some simple commands, a very easy way. Self-healing, it is keep on checking that. So self-healing concept is basically Kubernetes provided, correct? Service discovery and load balancing, right? Very easy manner we can just use it. Basically here we are not talking about completely the service discovery which we generally discuss into microservices concept. So Kubernetes also provide its own level, right? So secret and the configuration management, basically, if you wanted to use some secrets for, let's say, connecting to a Docker, or maybe if you wanted to use some secrets or for accessing other applications, right? There are some access tokens, some of these things which you can store it as part of secret and use the secret inside your containers. So in Kubernetes world, basically we have that at very high level. There are the clusters. Inside the clusters, there will be the nodes. Inside the nodes, you will have the pods. Inside the pod, you will have a particularly containers. So in one pod, you can have a multiple containers. And in one node, you can have a multiple pods, correct? And definitely is the nodes, you already know that it's nothing but is the your machines. So that is one pod can have a multiple. In Kubernetes world, we are generally not talking about in general manner for as a containers. In Kubernetes world, we basically use the word as a pods, correct? So in one pod, you can have a multiple containers, but ideally we use that one pod, one container, correct? On one node, multiple pods you can create it, means on one machines, you can create a multiple pods. That is basically is all about, correct? So this is what we are is all about that particularly Kubernetes scaling or that architectural wise. In Kubernetes, we basically have that Kube API server, correct? So Kube API server is basically is managing all these things. right? And Cube, when you install it, so you will see there is a one particular namespace, something called as a Cube system. So inside the Cube system, you can see there are multiple other you can say applications, but there is a Cube API server. So Cube API server is basically managing it, each and everything. And we can access this Cube API server through and different APIs, and it is basically connecting and doing all other stuff. So everything is done by majorly, it is a Cube API server. Okay. So Kubernetes, you can use that storage, that is we have discussed NFS, EBS or GFS like that, machines, VMs or physical or virtual machines, right? Or networking is basically a different networking, but we can use it, right? So this is particularly is all about that architecture wise. There are many more things also apart from this particular layer, right? So securities, right? There are also something we called as authentication authorizations, right? That is also part of your security. That is you can understand it. So you can use it through what we can say, create some different roles and attach to a particularly service account and other things like that. And if you wanted to secure this particularly access, so you can create a different level of services. So how you wanted to access, so basically your pods are getting access or sorry, containers will be accessed through a something we use the term as a pods, correct? So Kubernetes master server here. So that is we were discussing about that, where Cube API server is handling is each and everything. Schedulers, controller manager, cloud controller, like that, correct? And you will have the nodes here, correct? So Cube proxy, pods, and the containers. So that is we generally we are talking about that, correct? So kubelet through we will just access it, correct? To a connecting to a Cube API servers here. So in any particular node, you will have the term which we use it as a pods. So inside the pods, you will have the containers. Either it is a MySQL container, or it is a Postgres container, or it is a Java Spring Boot microservice, or anything like that. Correct. So registry, now you will see that this Docker, right? So Docker is nothing but Kubernetes will work on top of the Docker. So Kubernetes cannot run your application without any Docker image. Actually, Kubernetes is using that Docker image to run the application, to create a containers. So it is using internally the container concept here, right? So it is basically pulling that image from any other registry, right? So either it is a Docker or maybe a AWS ECR or GCR or whatever it is, correct? So this API master is basically using that YAML file. So nothing but that your configuration file, correct? So all this configuration, we will use it either if you wanted to deal with the configuration inside that Cube API server. So Kubernetes is purely use that one of that core config file. That is what we call as a kube config, correct? So this config file, I will show you the syntax. So everything, number of clusters you created, all the infrastructure and everything which is playing Cube API server, basically referring to a config file. So that config file, you don't need to create it. First time it is automatically getting created. If you wanted to create and change the configurations, so you can basically give that different config file path through the command here. So kubelet is basically you can nothing but your kubectl, what we can call as, through which you can access and you can connect it. It's a nothing but your client. Can you just be on mute, please, everybody?
First month
So this is all about here. So pods is a group or one or more containers, correct? That is services is give your pods as a stable IP. So every pod, if you wanted to access, that is you will access through a service here, correct? So there are a different level of services. One is basically for a cluster. One you can say node port, and third is a load balancer. So if you wanted to give and expose this particular service with the help of node balancer, an external word, you can use a node balancer. If you wanted to access your pods at the cluster level, you can use as a cluster IP. And if you wanted to just use for your internet level as for node to node connectivity or for your purpose, you can use as a node port as well. So without any node balancer, you can use as a node port and you can access and check it. Correct. So that is the way you can access these pods, or maybe you can say your containers. So as I told you, I'm just repeating it here. In your Kubernetes world, we are not discussing or something we called as a containers. So we will use the word as a pods. So these containers will be part of your pods. Okay. So volumes are nothing but the data which either you are passing to a container or you are taking from the container. Let's say if your application is generating the logs, you wanted to extract the log and process it through some other containers. So you are taking the data out. So you need to get this data and keep it into some other place. That is nothing but we need to create a volumes. Okay. So this is basically what we can say particularly world. Nodes are nothing but your machines. Either it is created on your own local machine or maybe on AWS or GCP or like that. So cluster IP service is basically if you wanted to access your pods inside the clusters, right? If you wanted to node port without any node balancer, if you wanted to access it, you can access it in the outside. But if you're using the node balancer, if you wanted to access this, you can use as a services at the load balancer. So there are 3 types of services. So good thing is that when you are using the service, these services are connecting to a pods. If your pod is having some issues or something like that, still your client application will not be getting impacted, because this service is nothing but the interface is basically which is used for accessing your pods or your containers, what we can say. So these IPs will not be getting changed and all other things will not be getting changed. So if this pod there is some problems or getting recreated, or maybe there are some issues, maybe you are just deleting and creating like that, or any challenge. So there is no impact on your client application. So this service is basically for interface to connect your pods or maybe accessing to your containers. Correct. So at very low level, it is basically what we can say is the cluster. Then there is a node port, and then very high level, which we can say is as a load balancer. Right. Also, there are different objects. So you can also say there is a replica set. How many replicas you wanted to create for particularly for your application. So 4 replicas, 5. So on the fly, just simple command, you can create a number of replicas. Correct. So deployment is nothing but you are creating is a deployment, right? Inside the deployment, you can specify multiple other configuration details, right? So deployment, in the deployment, you will specify what are the configuration for a pod. So in the pod, you will specify the details of a containers. So containers will, when you define the containers, you will specify the images and all other details. So stateful, daemon set, and the jobs. So jobs are also, if you wanted to create any cron jobs, right, using the containers, or maybe there is a simple job if you wanted to run it start and finish it like that. So also you can create it simple job. This job is nothing but you are running any application which is behaving like a job. Correct. So there are 2 types of jobs. So that is also you can do it in deployment. This is a very complete detail. So many things you can specify into a deployment, right? So in the detail, maybe we will see it, but you need to understand it. So there are different objects are there. Let's say network policy, volume, right? Persistent volume claim, pod, right? Job, cron job. Apart from that, right? Cluster role binding, right? Service account. So like these many objects you can create and you can use it, right? So pod is a group of containers. Containers run under the same network and the UTS namespace. So you can also create a namespace also. So let's say if you wanted to give some particular pods for a testing team, or some particular you can say space, or maybe you can give it access to a development team. So you can create a namespace. So this testing team will only use that namespace to create a pods or objects or any other things. So they will not touch to other namespace. So it is basically a virtual boundary, something we can say. So all these objects, maybe either network policies, services, deployment, pod, anything, they will create in their own namespace, right? So you can also restrict that access with the help of giving to some access to a service account or maybe a particular user, like that, like this. Okay. So containers in a pod share the same IP address and the port space, like this. Deployment objects generate the pods with the label and keep them alive. Service objects, grouping objects that give you a stable IP, virtual IP. So as I told you, right? So which is giving a access. So config map, yes. So this config map is also another object in the Kubernetes world where you can specify, you can something we can say the external configuration, any name value pairs, anything. So either you can create a config map with the simple key value pairs. You can also create a config map using any other text file also where you can specify name values, right? So you can say, you can specify the file path and you can create a config map, or you can also specify just simple command using the particularly name value, simple name value specify, or you can create a YAML file and you can create a config map object from the YAML file also. Okay. So this is the way you can use it and you can create it, correct? So this is the front end service, which is connecting to a 3 pods. And this pod is connecting to a backend service. This pod IP, you can say nothing but the database. And let's say front end, these are something you can consider as a React app. So it is using any other Node app or Spring Boot app. And this is basically the IP like this. So this is the simple topology, what we can say for a particularly what we can say any other application. So 3-tier applications, you will have a front end, there will be a back end, and there is a database. So here you can say node 1, node 2, node 3, right? In the 3 replicas. So here replica 1, you can just say, okay, this is not a 3 replicas. Basically, this is a 1 replica. But if you wanted to create a 3 replicas on 3 different nodes, so you can specify in such a way, like this. Okay. So 3 nodes on 3 replicas, you can create it. Correct, like this. So learning, you can use the Minikube, you can install it, right? And if you wanted to Kubernetes.io, you can refer it, right? And if you wanted to access any other things here, you can simply, what we can say, install that Minikube, Docker desktop, and kubectl, right? So simple commands, you can just go onto Kubernetes.io, and in Kubernetes.io, you can just search for that installation steps, simple installation steps, kubectl, you can install it, Docker desktop, you can install it with it is provide the single node setup. So if I will share you Docker desktop, right? So Docker desktop. So in Docker desktop, you will see, right? So here you can see this is a Docker is running and this Kubernetes is also running, right? So in this Kubernetes, you can also see the settings and everything, and you can use that Kubernetes also from you. So this volumes and containers and everything, these images, it is belongs to a Docker, not for a Kubernetes, right? It will, here we can use that in the setting. You can also see this Kubernetes, right? Click on and you will see enable Kubernetes. So which version we are using. So this is the version, you can use it like that. Okay. So this is the way you can just use that, right? So you, even though if you are using this, so you don't require actually a Minikube, right? So you can, here you can use the kind, right? So kind, basically you can use it with the this Kubernetes and start accessing, and you can play around and around with the simple. Earlier, Kubernetes also provide that virtual terminal from the Kubernetes site itself, from the browser base. But I guess they are not providing it. So you need to install this software and you need to do it. So many such things are basically you can do it, right? So Kubernetes, it's a main requirement. Either you are as a DevOps engineer or it is any application developer, right? So basic level, you can start playing around and around with this. But if you really wanted to have a good hands-on and wanted to have a strong knowledge, so you can use and you can go for the CKAD certifications. So that is basically we are launching for CKAD Kubernetes application developer certifications. Correct. So to start with, definitely you can start with some basics with like that, and you can play around and around with this. I will show you one more thing, how you can run and check that some simple commands. If you have installed that, so you can just kubectl, right? So you see, so if you wanted to see kubectl total number of running pods, right? So this is the way you can find out the number of running pods here, right? So it is saying in the default namespace, if I haven't created a namespace, you can say this. So you can create the pod like this, kubectl, right? Run banking app. So this is the pod name. So run is a command for, so you can specify image is equal to this is one of that Spring Boot image I have it, correct? So it is the kubectl. So you see this pod has been created. Now you can say kubectl get pods, right? So you see this ready one-on-one. If this application is running, you will see the application is running, and then you can just see. So this image, if you have know that how to create an image, you can use the image name. If I can specify the image as a Postgres image or MySQL or any image. So this simple command will create a, so it has created a pod, and in the pod we have one container. So you can also use, using that command, you can create it, or you can create a, what we can say, the simple configuration file, and then also you can create it. So kubectl logs banking app. So it will give that entire logs, right? So you don't need to go and check and each and everything, download all this stuff. Simple command, you can get that logs also. So you see this particularly application is running on port like that. Correct. To access this, you need to express via the services here. So this is the way you can run. To access this, you can run either curl command, you can run it from this terminal, or maybe you can create a service and then you can access, and you can just